Today it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Adam Carrington. You are with us. You're on, sir.
Thank you for taking your time to do this. And a few weeks ago, I didn't know that Zoom existed or what it was, and I've had to learn very quickly to teach my students, which I've missed them very much. I'm sure you all miss getting together for events like this, and been very encouraged at how American citizens have been all in this together, and very much encouraged that you would take the time to do this, that as much as we're teaching and learning with students here on campus normally, we also believe we're part of the bigger project of American self-government, and for you all to take time to be part of this discussion shows the kind of citizenship that we're hoping we're cultivating in the young people that we're teaching here. So thank you very much. And what I'd like to talk about today is to maybe start and ask, what's good about a crisis, right? We've been thinking a lot these days about what is bad, and that's pretty normal. We're thinking about in this current COVID-19 crisis, the death toll, and what impact that is having, the economic impact, how many people are losing their jobs and livelihoods, the damage to people's spirit when they're not able to live freely the way that they normally do. I think that's pretty normal. It's normal to ask those kind of questions, to wonder about the negative impacts on those things, the negative impacts on our civil liberties and more. But my question is, and from the perspective of my teaching, can there be good? Can there be something good in a crisis? And I'm not meaning this in, if anyone remembers Rahm Emanuel's infamous words, never let a good crisis go to waste, at least not the way he did. But I think in a sense, we shouldn't let a crisis go to waste. And what I mean by that is what crises can do. And we shouldn't welcome them, but what they can do if we face one is they force us to assess ourselves, and to ultimately, if we welcome that assessment, to know ourselves better. And to know ourselves better by, one, forcing us to define our principles, maybe more than we've had to in normal times, and to consider what they mean for real life, the real lives of ourselves, our citizens, and our government. And what I'd like to do is, of course, many directions that could go. What I'd like to take a little bit of time to discuss is something we can learn about our country and its principles in the midst of this pandemic. And that is about the question of the rule of law and how we can understand its own nature, what the rule of law is, and how we can see its relationship to the other things that I mentioned in the subtitle of the talk, particularly to executive power. And I think that's especially important for many Americans in Kansas, certainly here in Michigan, that we see governors doing so much and taking so much of the initiative in assessing how much of a crisis is this, what should or shouldn't be done in relation to it. And what I'd like to sort of ask is, after figuring out a little bit about what do we even mean by the rule of law in the United States? Why is it so important? What is it? To see how does that relate to governors, to presidents, to this thing called executive power that our Constitution envisions the national government having, and that our state constitutions envision our state governors to have. And then I want to ask how the relationship between the rule of law and executive power, what does circumstances like our own, where there's a claim to, of a health emergency, how are we to think about the relationship between the rule of law and executive power there? And I'm going to try to really bring in a bit of what I think the American founders thought on this as a way of giving us sort of tools and refining the tools we already have to think about what's going on in our individual states and in our country as a whole. So the starting point for this that I'd like to turn to is the rule of law itself. And it's beyond doubt that we, across our history, across even partisan divides, claim that fidelity to the rule of law is something that is inherently American and essentially American. I'll just give you two 20th century Republican presidents that said something about this. And I could have done more. I had a whole host of quotes, 19th, 20th, and into the 21st century. President Eisenhower, who I'm sure you all know and I'm sure many are fond of, actually said, if civilization is to survive, it must choose the rule of law. So the very survival of civilization, he tied to this thing called the rule of law. Ronald Reagan said, freedom, and I'm quoting again, freedom prospers when religion is vibrant and the rule of law under God is acknowledged. Now, why? Sometimes the phrase "the rule of law," it's almost like those who go to church hearing about Jesus rising from the dead. That it almost becomes something you don't even think about, or at least don't get the importance of or struggle to, and we almost become too familiar with it. So what I would like to really do is say, why do we have this commitment first? And I think why we have this commitment first is how it relates to our greater purpose as a political society. What is America founded upon? And how does the rule of law connect to that? And I think the first place to look for this is in our Declaration of Independence, where it gives a kind of anthropology, and that's just a fancy word for what are human beings like. And what are human beings like? Well, they're born or created by God equal. And what are they equal in particular regarding? What are called natural or unalienable rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And that what the Declaration then argues is that why do we have governments then? It's because of who we are as human beings. Governments exist to secure those rights, not to give them. God gives them, but to protect them, to make sure that we are able to exercise them to the best of our ability. And what we have seen, or what we see if we look at the logic of the American founding, the logic of America as a political community, is that the rule of law is seen as a means, in fact, the best means to do that. The best means to have government do what it's supposed to do to fulfill its ends, and therefore for us, pardon me, that's our attempt to save the environment here. If I don't move enough, the lights go out in my office. I apologize. I'll have to move my hands a little more. But the rule of law is seen as a means to make this happen, and the best means. And in order to understand why is it the best means, why do we want to have rule of law, we have to figure out, well, what was the alternative? What were the American founders rejecting? And what they were rejecting, we can see in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which was written, by the way, by John Adams, the first vice president, second president of the United States. And it argues that the goal of the Massachusetts state constitution was to create, quote, a government of laws and not of men. And that's a phrase we see from Adams and other places. We see it throughout American history, that we want a government of laws, not of men, meaning the choice was, are we going to have men or human beings rule, or are we going to have laws rule? And this choice, by the way, predates the Americans. The bio that was being read mentioned that we study Aristotle here. He was an old Greek philosopher, someone that the American founders read very carefully. And he even says in 400 BC, around 400 BC, that we have to choose: is it better for men to rule, or is it better for laws to rule? And we chose laws. Now, why? Why did we choose laws as being better to rule? And I think this is very important to keep in mind in relation to what we're doing right now. One is that laws are known, right? You can read a law that's written down in a statute book, accessible online, then you can read the mind of a person. And by the way, that means you can also hold people, rulers accountable more for a text that you can point at and say, here's the rules, I followed them, or here's the rules, you didn't, right? Also, it might keep rulers more humble. They might be more humble because they have to actually publish what they're going to abide by, what they're going to enforce, right? So it's known. Second, I'd say it's consistent. It would be really hard to follow traffic laws if every random 20 to 50 minutes the speed limit changed on a road, right? And having the laws determine questions like that gives some consistency and lets us know what is within and without the bounds of what's acceptable. And then I'd also say they're equal, and that's very important. That the when laws aren't written down, there can be a tendency for people enforcing them to hurt enemies and help friends. And what a written out law tends to do is make it so that we judge people by the standard of what they do, not who they are. If you go back to the Bible, when the ancient Israelites are talking about the how judges should judge, it says that they should distinguish between actions, law breaking, law abiding, not the persons committing those actions, whether they're rich or poor, Hebrew or not. In fact, the Hebrew actually is they shouldn't be a respecter of faces, right? Everyone should be equal in who they are. They should only be treated differently based on what they do according to law. And the idea is all of these things protect rights better by law than they do by individuals acting. They make our life, our liberty, our property more secure from violation. And we have all sorts of mechanisms in our governments, state and national, to try to uphold this thing called the rule of law and to make it so that men don't rule instead. One of these is just having constitutions at all, that you have a supreme law that is over and above any political actor that must be submitted to. Another is just having legislatures. By having legislatures, they normally have to pass written laws. So with written laws, we can again have some determination of what's true and not, what's acceptable and what's not. You can point to an actual standard to abide by. Another, I would say, is the separation of powers in federalism. Separation of powers in federalism divides the functions of government, divides the powers of government, so one person is not completely in control. One body isn't completely in control. So what has to be in control for them to all work together? It should be common laws that are dictating to them how to approach a finding, how to approach actions, not their own whims. By the way, for those who follow the courts, defense of originalism or textualism, a la Justice Scalia, is very much grounded in that understanding that laws and rules can tell us what to do. We don't just manipulate them to do what we want, or at least we shouldn't, I should say. And I would say for another place to find this in the founding is to turn to the Federalist Papers, and particularly Federalist I that was written by Alexander Hamilton. And the most famous part of Federalist I, and for those, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Federalist Papers, these were the newspaper articles that collected became the definitive defense of and articulation of our U.S. Constitution while it was being ratified. And Hamilton there says, I'll quote a little bit from it. He says, "It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. So from the very beginning, we Americans have basically thought the fate of freedom and the fate of self-government was on us, right? And Hamilton states that from the Constitution's ratification period. Even before that, it was stated. But notice he sets up two foundations for political societies. Some societies are created by accident or force. Accident meaning something unanticipated, a natural disaster, or you somehow missed being shot at, right? And force. Whoever has the bigger guns or the more numbers wins. And he says a lot of governments have been formed that way. In fact, so many have been formed that way. There's the question in 1787, 1788, is this the only way governments can be formed? Is by tyranny or luck, basically. And he says what we're going to try to do is offer an alternative. We're going to try to set up political societies not based on accident and force, but on reflection and choice. And those are opposites. You can't reflect on accidents because they're unforeseen. They're unpredictable. You can't choose when forced because force itself denies choice. And this hope and commitment to trying to form a government by reflection and choice, I would say, is a prerequisite to the rule of law that we've been talking about. Reflection and choice, you need the ability to reflect. You need the ability to know if you're ever going to make laws that are going to make any sense. If you're ever going to make laws that are to protect rights, you need to know what rights are. You need to know what ones we're born with. Also, you need the capacity to choose, to decide. Free government of, by, and for the people requires that there is some possibility of choosing, that there's some freedom to human life. And so, and by the way, I'd say accident and force, therefore, by being the opposite of reflection and choice, are inconsistent with the rule of law. Accident, again, how do you know how to make a rule if accidents are sort of the norm, right? How do you know how to act if, how can you act freely if there's force, if the ruling element just dictates to you what can and can't be done? And so I would say all this is well and good. We're committed to the rule of law to protect individual rights. We want to overcome accident and force. And Hamilton would, I think, look back and say we've done as well as anybody in the history of the world in trying to deliberate and choose as opposed to the alternative. But here I'd say we start to run into a problem and starting to move in the direction of what we're dealing with here. And that difference is, sure, we would want the rule of law, sure, we would want to rule by laws deliberated upon and chosen. And in a perfect world, we'd be able to perfectly. In a perfect world, we would know perfectly, and we would follow or obey or accord with law perfectly. We'd have perfect laws perfectly obeyed, right? Here's the question. Is this a perfect world that we're in? And if anyone ever had that idea, I think living through these times would disabuse us of that. No, we don't. We can't perfectly, can we ever perfectly know what will happen in our world or in our country? Can we anticipate anything in the future? I think the fact of this pandemic and then the after effects of it all show us, no, we can't. The other is about laws themselves. Does the very fact that people know what the laws are mean they're going to follow them, mean they're going to obey them? And in other words, can deliberation and choice basically convince everyone to be perfectly law-abiding? And and really what I'm asking is, as much as Hamilton says we want deliberation and choice, can we ever eliminate accident and force? Did the founders believe, as much as we want to deliberate and choose, as much as we want the rule of law in that way, can we ever get rid of accidents, knowing perfectly, or force the need for some kind of coercion? And the answer is no. We can't get rid of accident and force. We don't have complete control. We don't have perfect morality, I would say. And so therefore, this is where we bring in the founders' view of executive power. The executive power, as the founders were meant and understood it, whether at the state or national level, is supposed to be a way of not denying the rule of law, but dealing with the fact that we can't get rid of accident and force. We can't know perfectly. We can't, people aren't going to obey perfectly. And first, regarding force, I want to take a deeper dive into that, and we'll start to see, I think, how this might play out in some of the situations we find ourselves across the country. We don't want this force that executive power is going to be part of addressing or part of using. We don't want it to be what actually rules. That would be tyranny. If force was actually the thing that that the whim of the ruler and the strength of the ruler is what really made the difference. Instead, there has to be a way for force to help law. And a way to think about that is, on one hand, we can convince many citizens to be law-abiding just because the law is the law. They'll obey the law because they know it's true, they know it's the case, they know they should. But I guess a way to sort of reinforce the problem, to try to kind of give the executive as a solution is, if you knew there were going to be no cops out on a normal day, would you follow the speed limit? If you think they might not be there, do you follow the speed limit? If not, Hamilton has a word for you. In Federalist 15, he actually says, "Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint." In other words, what do you do about the fact that passing a law, telling people what the law is, isn't enough for everybody? We still have people who are willing to murder. We still have people that are willing to steal, to kidnap, to violate, therefore, our life, liberty, and property, even though the law tells us not to. He says, you're going to have that because human beings are imperfect. And what he argues is we need something to support the laws. In other words, might doesn't make right, but might, meaning force, sometimes can support right. In other words, force can be used not to dictate what justice is, not to dictate what the laws are, but to support the law by saying those who are unwilling to follow it need to be restrained. Murderers need to be restrained. Thieves need to be restrained. And this is why we don't just have a legislative power. We have an executive power. Why do we need enforcement of the laws? Because of this a reality about human beings. And we can see, at least abstractly, why this might be an issue in a health crisis. Might there be people, depending upon the nature of the crisis, who could be reckless regarding their health and safety, not in a way that endangers just themselves, but others? That's a question that has to be asked. Might they do so in violation of reasonable laws? And I say reasonable laws. We'll get to the question of unreasonable ones. And in fact, why do we have health codes at restaurants? Why do people come in, health inspectors, and force them to restaurants to cook food, right? And possibly bring charges against them if they don't. It's the idea that other people are owed that kind of protection. All right. And so I think that that is at least why you need force, why you need more than just lawmaking. What about accident? Accident, again, is unanticipated circumstances, things happening that you don't anticipate. and things that you can't predict. And by the way, it's impossible for us to predict anything and everything that can happen. And if we can't predict it, how can we pass laws that directly touch upon it? There's just going to be instances where things we didn't anticipate come up. And the question is, under the rule of law, are we just out of luck if something like that comes along? And the founders, I didn't think so. They didn't think so. They thought that there needs to be something in government that when something unexpected comes up, at least until we can get a handle on it, there needs to be an element of the government that can address it for the safety of the people. And that's, again, where they look to the executive, that when there are accidents, often it's the executive who at first, not permanently, but at first can address things. And why is that? Why would they have the executive there for emergencies, or at least to be the first reactor to emergencies? It's partly because think of how executives are set up, presidential and state level, compared to, say, Congress or the courts or state legislatures and state courts. We often only have, really everywhere, just one governor. And what's an advantage of having one governor versus having 15 or even 3? And an advantage is by having one, they can be decisive, they can be active, they can be quick if there's some emergency that comes along. And that's often, by the way, why legislatures often give governors wide berth to declare emergencies. It's to say that there might be instances where they need to step in. Now, by the way, these need to be temporary. The legislature should and be willing to come in along with courts and say when this has gone too far. And I think there's very legitimate questions about that in many states across the country right now. But the founders still believe there needed to be some swift action. FDR needed to respond to Pearl Harbor immediately, not wait for Congress to pass things, even as Congress was going to be brought in later, for example. And so I think that if we understand that role of why we have executive power, how it relates to the fact that there are unanticipated circumstances, we can start to think about how that might relate to today. And how does it apply to our current crisis? And I really can't give one answer, or at least one specific answer, because so many states are acting in so many different ways, and states have been the main ones taking the lead on this crisis. And I think rightly so. I think it would be fairly foolish to say that New York and New York City needs to be treated the same as, say, Tennessee, given how things are going in each state. But I would give you some broader things to think about in light of what I've tried to articulate about the rule of law, executive power, and this question of accidents like a pandemic that seems to come along only once every very long time. And that is how do we maintain the rule of law but acknowledge its limits, acknowledge accident and force? And how do we keep some realm for accident and force without allowing it to become tyranny, without allowing governors, in this case, to just do whatever they want and claim that it's for the common good, claim it's for the American people or the people of their state's benefit? And I think what we ultimately have to do is sort of twofold. First, regarding accident, we have to always keep in mind, what's the goal here? What are we trying to accomplish? And I think there's some debate about that in some states. But ultimately, it should be we're trying to protect the individual rights of citizens, whether it be of Kansas, here in Michigan, whatever state it is. And we have to understand that the protection of those rights includes not just life, but the liberty, property, pursuit of happiness of all involved. And that in some ways that's going to involve trade-offs. thinking in sort of logical and thoughtful terms about the interplay between people's jobs, people's liberties, and people's lives. Second, it's going to require us to be really thinking not just abstractly, but thinking about the situation on the ground. How bad of a crisis is this actually? Is it more of one in some places than another? And rigorously holding governors and eventually also state legislatures and judges, any of our elected or chosen officials, to the goal of, is this really protecting individual rights or not? Is this really fulfilling the role of government? And I'd say the same thing is with force. It's perfectly legitimate to stop a murderer. I would say it's perfectly legitimate in certain instances to make some people take health and safety precautions for the sake of others. But we have to seriously ask how far is necessary and not allowing it to go any further than that. And again, that's going to vary state to state, but we can't let the need for addressing accident overwhelm the need for protecting the rule of law and protecting individual rights regarding that. And I think if we can, think in those terms and try to apply those conditions to the particular states and situations we're in, holding, the different branches accountable, ourselves assessing the problem on the ground, I think we can think like the founders. We can think like Alexander Hamilton. We can think like Jefferson. And we can continue the principles and structures that they themselves were trying to uphold in forming this Constitution. We can uphold the power of deliberation and choice. We can uphold the rule of law over any attempts to try to impose tyranny on us. And so what I'd really like to do is to exhort you with that, to try to encourage you with that, that what we should not do is we should not let this crisis go to waste, that we should seek to learn from it, that we should seek to be vigilant in the midst of it, that we should recognize that true self-government is a complicated thing, and that it's really trying to bring together how do we have the unified goal of protecting rights through government and protecting rights from the infringement of government. And that just gets so much harder in the case of situations like this where it's not normal, where times are not normal. So what I'd exhort you all to do is to let us seek in this time to strengthen the rule of law, to strengthen our understanding of the Constitution, to strengthen our participation in our form of self-government. And that in doing so, I think will not only strengthen our adherence to that document, I think we'll do a lot more. I think we'll strengthen ourselves, we'll strengthen our country, and in the midst of a crisis like this, I think we will renew America and renew America's values and principles. Many are seeing this as a time where they're endangered. I would say that at times when they're endangered are the very times where they can be renewed in a special particular way. So actually, I think I'll stop there. Leave you with that, and thank you very much for listening to this, and hope it's something that's helped you think through these things, and happy to take some questions from here on.
Dr. Carrington, thank you so much for making time for us. Let me fix my microphone real quick. All right, that should work a little better. Thank you so much for making time for us as questions are coming in. And just a reminder to everyone, you can type your questions into the chat and I will relay them for you. I see that we have some folks who have called in by phone, and for you, you can text me at 316-249-3198. And just a softball, Dr. Carrington, to start off the questions. holding in mind the rule of law as it protects the balance of life, liberty, property, how does civil dissent figure into that, especially at this juncture with COVID-19?
Right. Well, I think that the thing to start with is who ultimately is the sovereign in this country, and sovereignty meaning who's the ultimate unparalleled ruler. And our national constitution says it's we the people, and most of our constitutions, or really all of them, say it's we the people of the states in there. And what's interesting is we don't rule directly. We rule through representatives. We rule through people we vote for. And so I think the idea of civil disobedience, I'd say two things about it. One, I think done rightly, it can be a very legitimate way of making sure you're being heard and making sure that those who we elected are aware of how we see the proper balance of protecting our rights through government action and protecting us against government overreach, really the balance there. The second, though, is I'd say it needs to be done in as law-abiding a way as possible. And why would I say that? One is, I think, just a legitimacy argument. You don't want to be seen as a lawbreaker, except in the most extreme circumstances. But the other thing is, ultimately, if we want to have the rule of law, we need to try whenever possible to respect the rule of law by making our voice heard in legal ways. Because what we want is we don't want to diminish the value and the legitimacy of good laws merely in the way that we fight bad laws. This was Martin Luther King Jr. was very articulate on this. If you look at his letter from a Birmingham jail, he civilly disobeyed bad laws and then willingly went to jail. Why? Because he didn't want to undermine the good laws that were supposed to protect his and his fellow parishioners' life, liberty, and property. So that's what I would say to that is it's legitimate as long as it's upholding the rule of law and seeking to make sure the rule of law accords with the consent of the governed and the rights of the people.
Thank you for that. We had a follow-up question in the chat. How else can we be heard other than civil disobedience?
Yeah, I would actually say that's not the first thing you should do. Just because civil disobedience is often antagonistic, and there are definitely times for that. We were born in throwing tea into the Boston Harbor, right? But I think the other ways is writing and calling your elected officials, talking with fellow citizens, writing letters to the editor, which I promise you are being read by elected officials who are nervous about not being overwhelmed by opposition and the choices they make in this time and place. And I would say that all of those are just exercising self-government. Make your voice heard. There is free speech here, and I would say that use it. And this is another great thing about the rule of law. Abraham Lincoln said there's sort of two ways for people to make decisions: ballots or bullets. He said, and I think what's distinctly amazing about us is, with few exceptions, we make decisions by ballots, but ballots can only be by making your voice heard in other ways. And that we have to respect that, so we don't have to go to something more violent or something, the way that many other countries settle their differences. So I think any way that you can communicate with your fellow citizens or your elected officials is a necessary part of normal self-government, and I would say an even more necessary part of something like this. Don't cede your self-government to other people.
And we're just going to keep the follow-up train going. There's a follow-up to that. Do our courts play a role in this?
Absolutely. I sort of I joked with my students that I wanted to do maybe a lot yourself or people you know take personality quizzes online. This used to be a really big thing. What's interesting is that I think different branches have personalities. I almost said I should do a personality quiz. Which branch of government are you personality wise? And executives are really good because of them being unitary at quick, decisive action, quick, decisive responses. I think it's not a coincidence that President Trump's personality makes much more sense as a president than it would as as a part of Congress or the courts because of his personality. He's a very decisive person. What are courts and legislatures good at? And I think these need to come in more and more as we start to get a better idea of what kind of crisis, if any, are we dealing with. And what courts are very good at is pulling back elected officials who are tempted to not follow the law, who are tempted to follow only public opinion, even if it's against the law. And the best way, the authoritative manifestation of public opinion is the law. And they're the ones that are trying to maintain the Constitution, and I think the most direct way. So what I think, courts aren't very good at making quick, snap decisions. They're not very good at legislating in that sense. But I think that what they can do is police the outer boundaries. That when elected officials are flagrantly going beyond what the American people have empowered them to do, what state constitutions have empowered them to do, that's when they can step in. I don't like them micromanaging a health crisis, but I think that if your governor is shutting down your free speech, for example, that's something that courts need to step in and shut down very quickly.
And we've got a question from the chat. I'll just read it in full. When the crisis passes, government actors will write the historical narrative, putting themselves in a competent and heroic light when we know the truth is very different. How can we create an accurate narrative that will shape the future conversation about emergencies?
Very good question. One that might not seem as obvious is elections. I was just teaching to my American presidency class Jimmy Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech. If anyone remembers that, I'm sure a number of you probably saw it when it was given. And I noted to them that Jimmy Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech actually got him a poll bump. He actually improved in the polls originally, but as time went on, people started to see that speech for what it was, which was a kind of whining that was blaming the American people when he really should have been blaming himself more. And so I would say elections matter, and his interpretation of what was going on lost out, in part because Reagan beat him the next year. So those matter. I'd also say free speech again and freedom of the press. Just because government officials try to self-define doesn't mean that needs to be the narrative itself. And I think some of the scandals with Hillary Clinton during the 2016 race showed, for example, that as much as politicians try to define themselves, if the American people are unwilling to accept it, that's not going to become the settled narrative. So again, I don't mean to be a broken record, but I would say, don't accept the narrative just because people in power are trying to articulate it. Voice a different view at the ballot box, voice a different view in other ways. However that, needs to manifest itself.
All right, a little more kind of a philosophical question. What is the proper role of government as it relates to facilitating and empowering knowledge markets? I think now we're in a situation where a lot of us suffer an absence of knowledge about this virus, the actual disease it causes, what is the government's role in facilitating knowledge?
Yeah, there's a wide answer to that and a narrow one. I mean, the wide one is, I think that apart from this pandemic, I think that the government has a necessary role in facilitating a proper education. And I say facilitating, I don't mean that means everyone has to go to public school. We're a private school here. But self-government, the rule of law, I said before, requires reflection and choice. You can't reflect on what you don't know. And so there's a bigger responsibility for that. But more narrowly, one of the difficulties with this pandemic is the fact that we've not had a scare like this in about a century. There's not a blueprint for this like there is for hurricanes and tornadoes or other natural events. A lot of people in the government pretty obviously don't know exactly how bad of a threat this really is, and things are changing constantly. And I think that's one reason, by the way, why you saw such extreme measures that I think are basically going to have to be unrepeatable after this episode. The very fact that they had such extreme blanket shutdowns like they've had is actually an admission of ignorance. It's an admission of failure, saying we really don't know enough to have a targeted response to this. And so I think that their responsibility is to, the more that they do know, being willing to change their course of action. I think we should be able to cut them some slack based on the fact that we don't have pandemics or things like this every year. We shouldn't cut them slack if they don't respond to new information, which I think is a serious problem in many locales. And I think, therefore, what we are owed is honesty from them. Honesty from them as far as when the numbers change, and honesty from them when we start to learn different and new things. And I think that that's where, if you don't have that, you have a massive breakdown in trust between the American people and their government, which I think is something you're seeing right now. And I think also just we got to be honest that numbers are not going to be everything. I compared this to baseball. If a guy comes in and hits 4 for 5 on the first day, don't make him a Hall of Famer. And I think too many people looked at the first batch of numbers, and many in our government, and acted as if that wasn't going to change. And so I think that's government's responsibility, is without knowledge, you don't have self-government. And so it's responsible to be honest with us and respond to changes itself. Very good questions, by the way. Thank you for these.
Professor Carrington, let me ask, as one of the chronologically gifted people here, I do remember when I was a very young boy, particularly with the polio epidemics in the early 1950s and other quarantines that were covered by statute. We've got a lot of old statutes in place that haven't been used for a long, long time. And we're in this situation where this has become a national pandemic, but it's very isolated. We've got almost half the cases are basically, in terms of fatalities, in just the greater New York City area. In other parts of the country, I was looking at some places, I think South Dakota has had like 9 fatalities so far, and we're laying off people in hospitals right and left. Is this a good example of what I'd call a Hayekian pretense of knowledge, where we don't realize there's a lot of stuff that we don't know, and we make decisions based on incomplete information and then try and apply it widely when the situation in obviously some parts of this country is very dire, and other parts it's everybody's looking around going, say what happened? And we've got these statutes that are, many of them, close to 100 years old in some cases, and constitutional provisions for emergencies that we're trying to fit 21st century, our 21st century mode into maybe early 20th century statutes.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, and I think that this is where federalism matters. That what I don't, we hear all this talk about herd immunity. What we shouldn't have among governors is herd mentality. That and what I think and what I mean by that is I don't think South Dakota has to have the same rules that Michigan, for example, does. I don't even think that Michigan, the whole state of Michigan, has to have the same rules. And we've been very hard hit. Even my county has about 100 cases and double-digit deaths, and we're a tiny county, about 40,000 people. But our response doesn't need to be everybody else's. That's what I would say to that, and that governors need to stand up for their states. They need to stand up for the best interest of their states, and not just on the protection of life, the protection of the good life. Aristotle, going back to him, I teach him a lot here. He said, why do we have political communities? One is to live, but the other is to live well. And we need to be able to balance those two. Not just living, but living well, and that has ramifications. And then, yeah, I'd just say the last thing about your observation about old laws. That's one of the difficulties too. Is if it's a law that's being enforced and being applied every year, we kind of get used to and have had the battles already over where the contours are. How far can it go? When it hasn't been invoked in 50 or 100 years, then there's not this memory of how the laws are supposed to be applied. And I think Michigan's struggling with this right now. We've got emergency power declarations that are 60, 70 years old, and I think overly broadly written. And I hope the legislature revisits those because there's just not this experience. In some ways, the more we have laws around, the more we're able to curtail their enforcement and make sure they don't go beyond their bounds. So yeah, this is interesting times that force us to clarify things we didn't have to think about before.
Well, Professor Carrington, at this point, I can think of a couple more questions I'd like to throw out, but the clock is winding down. I want to once again thank Hillsdale College, give you also another plug. They've got some great online free classes for students of all ages. And in light of the current situation we're in, you can, we're all homeschoolers in a sense now. I want to thank you and all the folks who at your end helped make this possible, and also repeat my appreciation for Americans for Prosperity, as well as the National Pachyderm Federation and everyone who's tapped into the video this afternoon. I think it's been an excellent discussion, and Professor Carrington, thank you very much. And I'm going to wish everyone have a great, safe weekend.
Yeah, thank you all. This was a wonderful experience, and always glad to talk to fellow Americans.